and my name is Bruno Pozzi. I'm the director for the Europe office of the UN Environment Programme, and I really welcome you warmly to this meeting today that we organize together with UNEP and OCHA and what we call the Joint Environment Unit that works since a few years now at dealing with important environmental emergencies around the globe. We are hosted by the GEN, the Geneva Environmental Network, that you know very well, and I would like to thank the GEN team for organizing this meeting. Would like also to thank the Swiss Confederation for the support they give to the GEN and to UNEP in general. This is the second briefing that we organize since the beginning of September, the rentrée des classes for all of us in Geneva, and I'm really by opening this meeting to physical presence, but also online. We gather a number of colleagues and friends of the environment, not only in Geneva, but around the globe. With this, we will start the meeting, and I would like first to ask my friend and colleague Gary Lewis, who is the director of the Crisis Management Branch based in Geneva, to give a small introduction about his work and about the reason why it matters, the environment, when it comes to emergencies and humanitarian disasters.
Thank you very much, Bruno, and good morning, everyone, both here in Geneva and in different parts of the world listening into us. When the organizers of the World Economic Forum gathered earlier this year in January in Davos, they had before them a report compiled for that meeting, where they had asked about 1,000 businesswomen and businessmen for their assessment of what are the major challenges facing our planet right now, in terms of impact and in terms of likelihood. And right there at the top, for the first time since these meetings were held, starting 15 years ago, we saw a cluster of issues that can largely be described as threats coming from and to the environment. At the top is climate action failure, then extreme weather, then biodiversity loss, then natural disasters, then human-made environmental disasters and water crises. Only after that did they talk about the sorts of challenges that they used to, in terms of financial crises and interstate conflict and so forth. Our own Secretary General has described climate change as the most systemic threat to mankind today. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Gary Lewis, and I am the Director of Disasters and Conflicts at UNEP. The team that I am privileged to lead looks at some of the drivers of human insecurity and attempts to respond to them. We have about 140 people in our team. They are located here in Geneva, as well as Nairobi, New York, and a handful of states that are variously described as fragile. The focus of our work falls into 4 areas. The first is looking at environmental security, early warning, and some of the drivers and the pathways to insecurity that are being driven by environmental factors. The second is preventative. It focuses on ecosystem disaster risk reduction. The third, the one that we will focus on this morning, is rapid response to environmentally driven disasters. And the fourth, which involves most of our offices on the ground, is about stabilization recovery. I'd like to use this opportunity before 3 of our team members go into detail in some of the response areas that we have been focusing on, to thank OCHA, our sister agency just down the road here, for partnering with us for so many years through a joint environmental unit that you will see comes to feature very much in the proceedings this morning. I'd also like to thank those partners who have stayed steady with us over a number of years and provided us with the wherewithal, mainly the funding, through which we can effect some of these hopefully benign changes that we're going to talk about this morning. I'd like to recognize specifically the Swiss Confederation, Norway, Sweden, the United Kingdom, the European Union, and Japan. They have been providing us with the bulk of our funding for many years. I'm also relatively new to Geneva, having come in March, of course, 2 weeks before lockdown, so I haven't had a chance to physically interact with many of the colleagues who are probably calling in online. I look forward to doing so in the future in changed circumstances. But what I have observed in these several months is that the international Geneva flavor, that epithet, which tends to combine the elements of humanitarian response, environmental focus, and peace, is very much present here. And in fact, the intersection of those three areas very much comes together in the work of our team, on the Disasters and Conflicts team in UNEP. So those are the remarks I'd like to share. I'm very proud to see three of our team members who are active in three specific emergency crises speaking, and they will be holding the floor in a few moments. So I look forward to that, and I hope that you will benefit from the presentations and the question and answer session, and also from the few words of my colleague Rudy, who will speak shortly. Bruno, I'm happy to hand the floor back to you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Gary, for setting the scene and explaining indeed the important work that we do on this field. And as you said in the introductory remark, we do work very closely with OCHA, our sister agency, and I've got the pleasure now to welcome Rudy Müller, who is the chief of OCHA Geneva and the chief of Emergency Services Branch, to give us a few words as well before we go into the three examples of challenges that we are dealing with. Rudy.
Thank you very much, Bruno, and thank you very much, Gary, and thank you for handing the floor over to me for a few words. I'm happy to say a few things, particularly about the Joint Environment Unit. But first of all, I really want to emphasize also what you said, Gary. First of all, what the key threats are at the moment and how they are being considered, and what we need to do. So thanks indeed. I think you all know OCHA, and I don't need to go too much into the detail, but OCHA has basically 4 or 5 core mandates, core functions, which is information management, policy development, humanitarian financing, advocacy, but also, and this is particularly true and important, is to mobilize and coordinate humanitarian assistance to people in need. And in this regard, in my branch in particular, we have developed over the many years a number of tools and mechanisms which do actually enable the organization on behalf of the system to mobilize rapidly teams and mechanisms, often through partnerships, to support very rapidly people in need. UNDAC, the United Nations Disaster Assessment and Coordination Team, is a typical example. The work with the military partners, private sector, but also, and the Joint Environment Unit, I think, is key and very important. The importance has grown over the last years massively. Is also part of these tools and services. And for this, I would like particularly to thank also all the partners we have, and particularly also UNEP. We will hear soon about the work during COVID. It has been a challenge, of course. Not everything can be done remotely. Sometimes you need to have boots on the ground, and we have proven that in the context of Beirut and Mauritius, and we will hear presentations about it. Let me just say a few words about the unit. The goal of the unit is to respond as one to the environmental dimensions of emergencies. For over 25 years now, the Joint Environment Unit has successfully coupled UNEP's technical expertise with OCHA's humanitarian coordination mandate. I think this is the success of this particular unit. Over 700 environmental experts in more than 200 deployments in almost 100 countries since 1994 have taken place. The Joint Environment Unit also amplifies the outreach by operating through a network model. This unit engages closely with UN agencies, programs, and affiliated organizations, as well as regional organizations, member states, the private sector, the civil society, and the academia. Through its partners, the Joint Environment Unit ensures an interoperable and integrated response to a wide spectrum of technical issues. We have important standby partner arrangements, for example, with Sweden and others, the European Union, which can actually support our work for several weeks up to several months during the initial phase of a disaster or an emergency. Whether in response to natural hazards, technological accidents, or a combination of them, the Joint Environment Unit can mobilize technical expertise in very short notice for deployment to affected countries and provide also, what we have seen also during the COVID period, provide remote support. The Joint Environment Unit coordinates with partners to adapt to climate change, which is another important aspect, what we heard also from Gary. In humanitarian settings, it can increase collaboration between environmental and humanitarian actors and mitigate environmental risks in humanitarian projects and programs. And finally, I would like to come to the two recent deployments from the Joint Unit and mention that we will hear, and I would like to say that we will hear actually in the coming presentations more about this. And I have had some feedback already from my colleagues. It's been really interesting how our colleagues worked, particularly Margarita, who will present her experience after the Beirut explosion. Again, I would like to reiterate my profound thanks to all of you, the partners who support the Joint Environment Unit, the organizers of this event, and particularly also UNEP. Over to you, Bruno.
Well, thanks a lot, Rudi. And with this, I hope, colleagues, that you have a better understanding of the work that we do indeed jointly on the environment and together with OCHA. Now let's go into some examples of that work, and we'll go through 3 different presentations. After each presentation, there'll be a short time for question and answers, and Diana will help us with the questions that are put online. But so we will first start with one of the emergencies of the day, COVID-19 pandemic, its environmental impact, and what challenges it brought in terms of environment issues. So for this, I would like to ask our colleague Burali to, who is operation managers at the Crisis Management Branch, to make the presentation. Please.
Thank you, Bruno, and good morning, colleagues who are joining in the room as well as online for this session. So in this presentation, I would actually talk about the environmental linkages of COVID and what UNEP has been working on it. Now, I don't need to tell any of you about COVID. This is the crisis of our time, our generation, and this has been occupying our mind at least for the last 6 months. And we don't know how long it will continue to occupy our mind. As of yesterday, we have 27 million cases of COVID. 800,000, more than 800,000 people died. Luckily, close to 19 million people have survived COVID. But it still remains. The COVID, as well as the associated lockdown and the economic disruption it has caused, remain the #1 issue on the world scene at this point of time. And we, of course, fully acknowledge that this is primarily a health crisis, followed by an environmental crisis, followed by an economic crisis, followed by a labor crisis, followed by an educational crisis. But we just wanted to emphasize that in addition to being a health crisis, an economic crisis, crisis of employment, and education, there are also environmental linkages to this. And this was understood as early as last March. As the countries started getting into this crisis, we understood that there are multiple environmental linkages between COVID and the environment. The first one, of course, very obvious, that this disease at that time was considered possibly jumped from animals to human, and this may not be the last disease which will jump. The recent estimate says up to 75% of the recent diseases are jumping from animals to human. So clearly, we are in a period where the human ecosystem, human being interface is leading into health crisis and possible pandemic. The second issue, obviously, is the healthcare and infectious waste, which is being produced in large numbers as the hospitals are overwhelmed by patients. You almost produce 1 kilogram of infectious waste per patient per day, and even in countries which had fully developed system for dealing with healthcare waste, this is an issue. So you can only imagine in countries which did not have any facility for healthcare waste management, what that is doing to the healthcare waste management system. But not only, even the conventional waste management was very severely affected. Because people are in quarantine, because people are afraid of contaminating, waste are not being picked up, people are doing waste recycling almost vanished from the scene, their social ostracization increased, the waste recycling industry collapsed, and in some parts of the world, at least the plastic waste has made a huge comeback. We also saw impact on humanitarian action. Rudy mentioned to that. Hundreds of thousands of people were deployed into the ground in humanitarian situation. Many of them had to return. Many of them could not go to new humanitarian situation. As Rudy mentioned, we managed to get back to some of these locations, but with great difficulty. Going to Mauritius, which was a very simple act in the past, now need chartering a plane and staying in quarantine, etc., etc. So it has huge impact on humanitarian action. It had impact on biosphere reserves and national parks, impact on the wardens, but also when policing is reduced, the poaching increases. When tourism revenue decreases, there is not enough money to pay the wardens. So there are issues associated with that. Of course, when the economy is down, you have impact on climate action. And finally, when the economy is down, as it always happens, one of the first casualties is environmental standards. So when money is being pumped into the economy to recover, environmental standards are lowered. So the multiple impacts. So institutionally, UNEP took it a all of UNEP approach. It was not just a crisis issue and not a crisis management issue. We came out with our initial strategy as early as April, which had 4 building blocks. Number 1, naturally the medical and humanitarian emergency phase. Number 2, a transformational change for nature and people, how we manage our ecosystems, how we conserve our biodiversity. Number 3, investing in building back better. And number 4, continuing good global environmental governance in pandemic period and beyond. And in terms of operationalization of action, we had these 5 steps. Number 1, we plan to increase the awareness about the environmental linkages. It's not very obvious. For somebody who is impacted by this crisis, it's primarily a health crisis. Naturally, they see the economic angle. But the environmental angle is not always very obvious. In countries after countries, the ministries of environment were sometimes not aware, sometimes not involved in the response. Number two, provide best practices on how countries are dealing with and how countries could deal with these issues, and communities as well, and households. We also established a sort of help desk using internal resources so that member states who needed help can be provided real-time help on what type of incinerator to use. Is autoclave the right solution? What do we do with the issue of waste pickers and waste recycling? Luckily, we had a number of people in our team who had waste management background. They were employed on other projects, but nevertheless had experience. So we created a help desk and provided support, as we will see. The UN and the World Bank jointly with the European Commission has initiated COVID-linked needs assessment, like post-disaster needs assessment, and we contributed to a number of them. And now we are involved in recovery planning after the needs assessment and sometimes without a needs assessment. As countries learn to live with COVID, some of them recover from the first wave, they are preparing their recovery plans. How do we ensure that environment is included in those plans? Can you just move to the next one, please? Next slide, please. Yeah, I was moving, but it's not moving. Thank you. So initially, we came as part of our awareness campaign with a series of guidance notes from zoonotic diseases to green jobs to greening fiscal stimulus and finance package to achieve recovery, and then a series of 9 separate guidance notes on waste management. As I mentioned, this was truly all of UNEP approach. But not only, we also coordinated with other agencies, such as World Health Organization, such as UNIDO, such as UNICEF, who are also working on a number of these issues. So a series of guidance notes prepared between April and June, laid out and made available on our website, and also distributed to the member states. Then we went one step further. We started organizing global webinars, and we saw the tremendous appetite for this topic. So the first webinar we organized, we had a capacity of 1,000 people to be in the room. But the capacity was exceeded in first 1 minute of that. Then eventually we had to open up more, and we finally had 1,300 participants from 125 countries when we were speaking about COVID-linked waste management. Then we had a specific regional webinar for Asia Pacific, where we had over 450 participants, 46 countries, and we gave special emphasis on the issue of waste picking. As I mentioned, waste picking is an area where women and children are disproportionately employed. Their access to personal protective equipment was already very minimal. They were already not so much supported by the society. But COVID made it much, much worse for them. So we had a special session on that. We also had, with Joint Unit, another webinar on COVID and environmental emergencies. This is an ongoing series of 6 webinars, which identify each of the issues, such as impact on humanitarian action, such as impact on waste management. And currently we have about 4,000 people registered for it, and an average of 1,500 people participating from more than 130 countries. So tremendous, tremendous demand for these services. In addition to providing guidance notes, as well as webinar, we are also able to provide real-time, high-quality engineering technical advice to member states on what specific type of incinerator to use. How can you put together an autoclave locally. And we have been providing this service in the countries where we are physically present on the ground, such as Afghanistan, Sudan, South Sudan, and Haiti. We were involved in COVID-linked assessments already in South Africa, Serbia, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago, India, Haiti, and Sudan. We are involved in the recovery planning in the case of South Africa. But in addition to all this, we also have been supporting the UN missions, UN peacekeeping missions in over 15 countries and multiple locations where they had to decide in real time what do you do with COVID-linked solid waste as well as liquid waste. So a lot of real-time technical advice being given. Finally, the work is continuing. The demand is only increasing. Even though COVID, people have learned to live with COVID, many countries are still yet to face even the first wave, the full wave of COVID. The number of cases are still increasing. The situation is not getting better, and improvement in healthcare waste management, etc., cannot be achieved overnight. So the demand is still increasing. So we are planning to continue with our information dissemination, series of webinars planned, Africa, Latin America, Caribbean, Middle East, country-specific in local languages. So these will come in the coming months. We also have additional requests from the UNDP World Bank EC joint system for needs assessment. Currently planned, Philippines, Mauritius, Ecuador, Azerbaijan, Cape Verde, and El Salvador. And a lot more are coming. We also have technical assistance and other requests coming from a number of countries. And this number is increasing by the day. Obviously, initially we try to meet with internal resources. As I mentioned, we have a number of staff from our internal team who are able to give this support. We are now lucky to have some additional support facilitated by Sweden from their contingency agency. We are also deploying them to support member states. But the demand is still much more than that. So we are looking towards receiving support from member states. And that's one of the reasons we thought we should talk to you today. I will stop on my COVID-linked issues now, and then probably take some questions, and then I have one extra slide on another topic. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Murali, for the presentation and for underlining the need that is now well understood to also look at the environmental dimension of this COVID crisis, and member states answering to that need is really an important step that, thanks to the work of UNEP, has been realized. So I think we can take 5 minutes for question and answers, if there are any, and you can raise your hand. I think in the participants list there's a tool for this, or put it in writing. So we'll wait a few seconds and see if there are questions, or in the room, if there are, please raise your hand without any electronic device. And if there are no questions, we'll just...
I don't see any questions online.
Okay, maybe they will come later as well, and we can take them all out after the presentations as well. One more slide to present. Okay, we'll do that then. One more slide to present in... But there's one question. Oh, sorry. I haven't seen you. Sorry. Please.
Yes, Andrew Morton, UNEP. Just, Murali, if you could give us a bit more detail about what people are doing about the infrastructure issue with the lack of equipment and also the global supply chain, about some of these solutions and what interim solutions are working. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. This is actually the biggest issue. Many of these countries which is facing COVID have their existing waste management system, healthcare waste management system. But occasionally it is overwhelmed. But that phase is now past. Now they're preparing for future. But a number of countries where we are operating, especially the one we are operating, such as a fragile state, they did not have a system to begin with. So even if we were to give them the best solution, such as autoclave, they do not have access to that. And the disruption of the global supply chain has made it even more difficult. So therefore, we actually have to help them to fabricate local and appropriate solutions. That may not be the ideal solution, but that certainly mitigates risk much better than what is happening right now. What's happening right now is waste is being picked up, sometimes mixed, and often sent to a dump site or a landfill if they have. We are giving them alternative designs, which can be fabricated in almost any village, even in the most rural of the places. And such design can then mitigate the risk to a certain degree. To the degree that the local capacity is available to do something better, we also have calibrated response. Luckily, in the last 2 months, situation has improved. The global supply chain is beginning to move, and people are able to get more supply of things. So hopefully, we'll be able to give more calibrated, better and better solutions in the coming months. But they will also need resources. So that's one of the reasons why we are promoting this, that while resources are going directed towards naturally the healthcare, education, employment, there's also need for some resources to be directed in the countries towards better healthcare waste management system. Thank you.
Yes, and we've got one in the room, and then we'll take one question online, indeed. Please.
Thank you. I'm Peter Vermaarke from the Belgian delegation here in Geneva. When I see the words healthcare waste management, I see health, and I associate health with WHO. I see waste management, I associate it with environment and UNEP. How does the expertise of both organizations come together in what you presented today? Thank you.
Thank you. As I mentioned, this COVID is primarily a health crisis, and WHO has been leading that issue. But all of us have been supporting them. So as soon as we raise some of these issues, WHO already had put their own people to prepare healthcare waste management guidance, and we worked together. So we had an internal working group on healthcare waste management, and we worked with WHO at the very top so that our guidance is aligned. But then we operationally work together as well. For example, in India, where I was located for a few months, we were working almost on a day-to-day basis with the WHO office there. They have the linkages with the Ministry of Health. We have the linkages with the Ministry of Environment, so that we bring this together. But then in India, other agencies such as UNIDO had ongoing projects on working with hospitals as well as industry on what Andrew mentioned, on creating appropriate solutions, fabrication centers, etc. And then UNICEF, which has a lot of field operations. So we are working on a one UN system, both corporately as well as at the operational level. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So we'll take one last question on this topic for now, and so I'm keeping an eye on time as well, so that we can start the second item.
Yes, you, Gratna, the floor is yours. Yes, please
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks to UNEP and OCHA for organizing this briefing. We very much appreciate it. I'm Gratna Srivastava, elected focal person of the Children in Major Group to UN Environment Program, and speaking here on behalf of the youth constituency. First of all, we know that we haven't really interacted much with the group here in the past, so we appreciate this opportunity for dialogue. What we wanted to highlight were essentially 2 points. And the first one was when we are discussing specifically emergency response, whether that is COVID or other topics that are mentioned, how are you seeing the perspective or the service that are being provided to the youth audience and more specifically the children that are in the impacted areas? And I think this kind of question kind of cross-cuts all of the 3. And the second one would be really how can we, as the youth constituency, as the UN Agency for Children, support this more to highlight UNMGCY is co-chair of the Youth Compact Program on Humanitarian Action together with UNFPA and other colleagues at the UN agency, and has been working on providing COVID guidance that was published from member states and a lot of other toolkits for young people, or how basically governments can take action for young people in the times of COVID while respecting their human rights and other needs, including education. We are also working on broadly on the peace and security nexus to the Global Coalition on Youth, Peace and Security, and we would be happy to start collaboration or work more closely with the JEU, OCHA, and UNEP in the coming days. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the kind offer of support, and we would reach out to you after this event on to find out in what way we could support. In terms of our work in COVID, as I mentioned specifically, we found that the biggest disproportionate impact on women and children this COVID had, one of them was in the waste management sector. So children are involved in large numbers across the world, developing world in particular, in waste recycling, waste picking industry. And COVID waste actually made them sort of untouchable, and therefore they lost their jobs. There was no support system. In many places, they were migrants. They did not have they were not even benefiting from the national unemployment support, given many of them were below employable age. So there are many ways in which they were impacted, and we were trying to raise awareness on this. So we'll naturally be happy to work with you on the topic, and we'll get in touch with you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And with this, we will stop for now on this matter and move to the second session. And transition is what it is, but we couldn't avoid the catastrophe in Beirut, and it has created an incredible damage to a city and a country that has already suffered a lot in the last few decades. The environmental damage brought by the explosion is being assessed and being dealt with, and we have a colleague online, Margherita Fanchiotti, from the UNEP OCHA Joint Environment Unit, who is back from Beirut and is going to give us some highlights of the situation and the response that we can give to it. Margherita, to you.
You need to unmute you.
A very good day, everyone, and thank you very much, Bruno. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. I'm just back from Beirut, so this is also the reason why I'm joining remotely. I'm currently quarantining, but I was deployed there immediately after the explosions that happened on the 4th of August and that we have all seen in the news. Now, the causes of the event and the dynamics of the event remain uncertain, and there is an ongoing investigation into that. But according to government sources, it was the result of the ignition of 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate. And while the dynamics remain uncertain, what is certain is that this environmental emergency caused massive humanitarian impacts in a country that was already coping with multiple crises. On the one side, with the deep economic crisis, then on top of that, the impact of the Syrian crisis, and most recently, the COVID-19 pandemic. Overall, there were over 180 people who lost their lives. Unfortunately, more than 6,500 people were injured, and about 300,000 people were displaced. So this is yet another wake-up call of the catastrophic consequences that environmental emergencies can have, and on the fact that prevention can save lives. Maurice was one of those of the many that were injured during the Beirut explosions, and as he said, he has never seen a year like this before. Now, the event has triggered a very large response from the international humanitarian community. Many teams of international responders were dispatched to support the government-led response. And OCHA has a country office there, and we also dispatched an UNDAC team, a UN disaster assessment and coordination team, to coordinate international response in support of national efforts. And I was deployed as a UNEP staff member embedded in the UNDAC team to ensure that environmental considerations were anchored to emergency response from the very early stages of the response itself. Urban search and rescue teams were also deployed to support with search and rescue operations. The Lebanese Red Cross and all the NGOs and sectors that were active in Lebanon before the blast were also deeply engaged from day zero. And it's great to see all the world coming together to support Lebanon and its people, but this also requires coordination. And coordination is one of OCHA key functions. We've heard it from Rudy. It's also one of UNDAC's key functions. So this is one of the reasons why we were deployed there. And one of the main tasks that we had upon arrival in country was to set up the international coordination structure for the response in support of the national coordination structure established by the government. So you see what it looks like on the screen. And the key purpose of this is really to make sure that all capacities and capabilities that were dispatched internationally came together in the most effective and synchronized way to really build synergies and maximize efficiency and results. Now you see on top of this coordination structure the UN resident coordinator and humanitarian coordinator as the highest UN authority in country that leads the humanitarian country team, which embeds all humanitarian agencies. And we have then established a specific structure, the Emergency Operations Cell, for the response to the blast, which was chaired by OCHA. It also comprised the Lebanese Red Cross, as well as all the NGO representations and the key sectors involved in the response that you see here on the slide, and a number of sub-cells, of which one of them was the Environment Cell. Which I was leading. And you can really see in this coordination structure that it's thanks to the partnership with OCHA that UNEP, which is typically a non-resident agency, can really play a key role as the UN leading environmental authority in the immediate aftermath of an emergency, in the immediate response phase. So that's what happened in Beirut as well. And the Environment Cell, the role of the Environment Cell and my role in Beirut was to coordinate all environmental response. So leveraging all the expertise, the environmental expertise that was dispatched across different international teams in support, of course, of national efforts and in particular of the Lebanese Armed Forces and of the Ministry of Environment. Now, there were three main environmental concerns that quickly arose in the aftermath of the emergency. The first one was air pollution, directly linked, of course, to the explosion itself, so to ammonium nitrate and all the toxic gases that were released during the explosion, and of anything else that may have exploded along with that. The second concern were the other chemical substances and the residual risk at the port, so the other chemical substances that may have been stored there, And that, of course, could lead to cascading negative impacts both for humans and for the environment as a result of the explosion. And then the third main concern was the management of all the rubble and waste, including possibly asbestos and hazardous waste that was generated by the explosion. And I would like to show you here some of the key information products that we have produced to show key findings against these main environmental concerns. So the first one that you see here on this slide is a map that we have produced to show the extent of the potential harm to human health of the ammonium nitrate explosion itself. So while the chemical release per se happens very quickly and the resulting toxic plume is usually dispersed quite fast, this map shows you the extent of that pollution, which is lethal to humans up to 0.2 kilometers, and that's a red circle that you see on the map, and is harmful up to 3 kilometers, and that's the yellow circle on the map. Now, air pollution levels returned to pre-event level soon after the very sharp increase following the explosion, but the toxic dust will deposit on surfaces and can then be resuspended in air with movements like road traffic and cleanup operations and so on. And there's also a potential runoff into the water supply system in the event of rains. Now, the second concern, as I was mentioning, were all the other hazardous substances that were at the port, some of which were found during response operations. And we've helped the Lebanese Armed Forces and the Ministry of Environment in mapping those. So you see here one of the maps produced. One of the concerns was also the possible presence of asbestos, both at the port, but also in the buildings outside the port and across the city that also collapsed as a result of the explosion itself. And the third key concern was that of disaster waste management. So one of the key priorities was indeed the development of a disaster waste management plan that would take into consideration also the risks related to asbestos and other hazardous waste. So the classification hazardous and non-hazardous waste was one of the priorities, and is one of the priorities also for follow-up implementation for recovery and reconstruction plans. So to really ensure that hazardous waste is identified and disposed of as such, and that the portion of waste that is not hazardous is reused to the extent possible, given that landfilling and disposal capacities were already close to maximum capacity before the blast even happened. So this is another area that I've been involved in supporting during my deployment there, and in addition to working on the plan per se under the leadership of the Ministry of Environment, we've also provided training to all the NGOs and the volunteers and the refugees that have been involved in cleanup operations and that have very generously supported these efforts. Now, all the follow-up on these environmental risks and acute risks that were identified during the immediate response phase and that we have helped in mitigating from the first day of the response are now covered under the appeals and some of the funding that has already been allocated for recovery and reconstruction efforts. In particular, all the work on air pollution and related public health risks is covered under the flash appeal that was issued for a total of $565 million, of which over $85 million were just for the health sector, and that includes the work on environmental risks. To date, only 16.5% of the flash appeal has been funded. So this has been appealed, but there's still a long way to go before those funds are actually allocated. Then all the work on the rehabilitation of the damaged waste management infrastructure falls under the rapid damage and needs assessment that was produced jointly by the UN, the EU, and the World Bank. And you see here on the screen also the financial requirements for that, which are quite huge and covering all the recovery and reconstruction efforts. And then the disaster waste management plan per se has already been funded, so funding has been secured from the European Union, and that is 15 million euro for its implementation over the next year or so, depending on the actual implementation needs as we move forward. Now, this the blast and the emergency also shows lessons learned for ports globally, in particular as they relate to port safety and security. So other countries should learn on how not to repeat this situation and how to avoid the catastrophic consequences of this kind of environmental emergencies. But it also shows that it is only through coordination that you can really meaningfully contribute to a response, to triangulate efforts, and to really make sure that nobody is left behind. And that is all from my side. I will be happy to take any questions that you may have. Thanks.
Thanks a lot for this presentation and explanations about indeed how the impact of the blast on the environment has seriously affected not only the health of people, but also the conditions of living of the population that for years and years to come, and the need to action is definitely there. Any questions online or in the room? We don't see any hands raised online. So I know there are some questions please continue to ask questions, and we will take them at the end. We'll take 5 minutes at the end to take the questions that came during the presentations on the previous one. So with this, thanks a lot, Margherita. Please stay with us, and we will now look at another disaster that happened this summer, which is the oil spill in Mauritius from the WAKASHIO boat, oil tanker. And to give a presentation on how we reacted to this, I've got the pleasure to welcome Charlotta Benedek, who's with us, and is the head of the UNEP OCHA Joint Environment Unit, and dealt with this oil spill. Carlotta, to you.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Indeed, August was a busy month for our unit. We're not a big unit, and with Margherita gone, and Margherita is normally our emergency focal point, I was then thrown deep into water, clean water on this side, to deal with this. Luckily, and this is what I will talk about, we have the whole UNEP and the whole OCHA behind us, along with our partners. So I'll talk about how we work together to actually respond to this emergency. So, as you know, the bulk carrier vessel ran aground on the 25th of July. The causes are not clear. It will come to light, but it's not relevant for our discussions today. Some of you might wonder why it took so long between the 25th and the 6th of August, and I think it's clear that we had 100% vision in hindsight, but not necessarily as events unfold. And I've been speaking to a number of oil experts together with Murali and other colleagues, and they were saying that they didn't really foresee that what you see on the screen was going to happen. I think what it is clear is that when the risk became apparent, and that was on the 6th of August when assessors were able to come a bit closer, the Republic of Mauritius immediately put out a request for international assistance, and then that came to us on the 6th of August. So just to set a little bit of the scene, the vessel was actually empty, didn't carry any cargo. It did carry its own fuel oil, so around 4,000 tons, 200 tons of diesel, and 90 tons of lubricant oil. By the 11th of August, it was estimated that between 25 to half of that oil had leaked and drifted into the sea. And you can see our colleagues in European Commission map where you can see how the oil has spread. By the 15th of August, the ship broke into two, but at that point, most of the oil that was still in the tanker had been recovered. While, as Morelli mentioned, the number of tons of oil in the FSO and other emergencies that has happened, this might have been considered a small spill. It is, however, really important that we keep in mind that this is the worst in the history of Mauritius. It has endangered their corals, their fish, their marine life. It has huge impacts on their economy, their food security, health, and of course on the tourism industry, which is massive for this small country. They're already suffering from the effects of COVID-19. They had closed down, and now this happened. So I'll take a minute on this slide and the next one just to relate this spill to how we work. And you've heard a number of my colleagues talking about how we work in the unit and how we deploy experts together with us partners. So as you said, the request came in on the 6th, and the next day we had identified the expert and we had initiated his deployment. The reason the team didn't arrive on site until the 11th is due to the COVID context, and as I don't remember who said, but there were no flights to Mauritius. So our spill expert joined the team down in Nairobi, and our colleagues in OCHA Regional Office, together with WFP, chartered the flights and actually flew the people down to Mauritius, along with some other colleagues from other agencies based in Nairobi, and that helped with this. Margarita talked about the coordination structure in Lebanon, in Beirut. That was a typical UNDAC deployment following those sets. We in the unit followed always a sort of a predictable process. So a request will come in. We put an alert out on our coordination platform, which is the virtual OSOC, where we sort of outline the demands and the needs that we have. In parallel, we talk to our partners, mostly ECHO, the Swiss government in SDC. We talk to our counterparts in various agencies across Europe. And in this case, and as is international practice in oil spill, we obviously spoke to our colleagues in the International Maritime Organization. And I would like to just officially recognize them for all their support that they have given us to this. They were extremely fast. They managed to identify our expert, Matthew Somerville, who has over 30 years of experience. They also co-financed his deployment to us, so we are very grateful for that and for their support. So throughout any deployment, we will still be in contact with our colleagues in ECHO and in other parts of our network, and we are actually still, even though the emergency response phase has finished, we are still in contact with them so that we make sure that we gather all the information from all parts of the house and all parts of our other stakeholders to make sure that whatever comes up as new needs and post-emergency phase needs can be dealt with and that we can work together on those needs. So here is a little bit how it looked just for Mauritius. The response team was with our experts. We had two coordinating colleagues from the regional office in OCHA, also UNDAC trained, and they helped with all kinds of coordination support. Some of you might wonder why UNODC went down, but they are actually helping the government of Mauritius with some of the legal aspects of this and the claims that might come up, displacement expertise, and then we got excellent support, obviously, from the resident coordinators. I also just put up on the screen, there were a number of bilateral deployments. France sent experts, Japan, India. There are a number of NGOs, WFP, WHO, et cetera, who were not necessarily in our little coordination team, but part of the bigger UN country team that operates under a resident coordinator and obviously under the government of Mauritius, who is the overall responsible for the response. So one of the main tasks, and there were three kind of tasks from our group or from our team that they were dealing with. The main one for which we had the oil experts was obviously to provide an impartial and neutral understanding and support to the government of this spill. There was a lot of technical meetings and facilitating the understanding of the nature of the spill. What are the risks? What are the cleaning strategy? What are the different stages in the pollution process, to make sure that all national authorities, including the Environment Ministry, the Fisheries, the Police Commissioner, the Prime Minister, communities, etc., were aware of what was going on. So one of his main tasks was to actually advise the national authorities on how to deal with this. He also facilitated daily coordination meetings with the depollution companies that were working in the area. He acted as an advisor to the police commissioner, and the police commissioner was actually in charge of the overall response coordination from the government of Mauritius. And then setting up and supporting a strategy of how to work on the social and economic early recovery on the coastal communities. The team also, and this is one of the things that I think was very useful and that we got a lot of appreciation for, was to actually go in and set up a space for everyone to work together. So a little bit like an operations control center or the EOCs that Margarita was talking about. This was a center set up on near the spill site. It created just an entry point for everyone coming in, to make sure that they integrated together with the National Response Coordination System. Typically, we provide maps, internet connection, we organize meeting facilities, and just who does what where. And I think this is one of the things that we in OCHA do, and the Joint Environment Unit obviously also do when we go in, is to provide that space to make sure that everyone knows what everyone else is doing, and that everyone gets the support that they need. The third part of the team sort of tasks was the crisis communication. In any emergency, information flows left, right, center, up and down, and it's really important that we actually make sure that the communication and the information comes together and that it goes to the people who are in need of that information. So there was a lot of advocacy with various parts to make sure that information was flowing as it should. The UN mission managed information. We provided SITREPs, so situation reports that we normally do, given to everyone to make sure that we could have that flow of communication. Communication activities with the communities was very important. Another part of what we did, facilitating meetings, and apparently our expert was also on talk shows on the Mauritian TV, and also helped facilitate media field visits to the spill sites to make sure that the information was, as we said, and what is important in these cases, neutral, impartial, and fact-based. So, there. So what next? So obviously, as you know, we're continuing to remove, thank you, to remove any potential polluting material that's still there. We're still continuing to clean the shorelines. The obvious oil has been identified and removed where it's possible, but we're going to see oil coming up in other areas depending on the currents, etc. And what we have, even though our expert has left and is now at home in his home country, this is ongoing and will continue to go. I think there's while the and this is my last slide, so I'll soon be finished. I think while the emergency phase is finished, as one might say, there is in these cases obviously a very long-term, medium-term, and long-term sort of continuation to this, and there's a consortium including the World Bank, France, and UNDP, for example, to provide technical assistance, and colleagues in the crisis management branch and elsewhere in UNEP is providing input to that. We, together with Murali, were very early in contact with colleagues in Nairobi for the Nairobi Convention to see how we can fit those types of projects into the longer-term recovery and assessment of the oil spill down in Nairobi. And then from the other parts of the UN family, what we're looking at is emergency response planning, contingency planning. There's discussions about, for example, a regional contingency plan for that whole area under the resident coordinator. Earlier last year, there was a mission to Mauritius where we were part of that looked actually on emergency preparedness and disaster management system in the country. And I think the lessons learned and the experiences from this will feed into that plan, and so that we can update and revise it. And just as I said, and in closing, we are within the JU and within all our UNEP colleagues and the people on the ground continuously following up with our counterparts and colleagues elsewhere to see how we continue to support this, because even though for our emergency mandate it's finished, but we will obviously stay as long as it takes and help coming to terms with this. So thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Charlotte, for this presentation. And as I was writing down, coordination is key. That's really, I think, what you underlined as well. When we do rapid response, we need to have this coordination approach, and that's what UNEP OCHA Joint Environment Unit is also promoting. Any questions online, Diana? Or okay, so we'll take this question.
Okay, Enrico, I'm going to unmute you. You can raise your question.
Yes, thank you. My name is Eriko. I'm from the Mission of Japan in Geneva. Thank you very much for the very helpful presentations, very timely and very useful to know at this point. I would like to know that both of the emergency introduced here, the Beirut and Mauritius, are related to the maritime management, and I understood that there's a lot of things going on in terms of response, but in terms of like structural issues regarding maritime safety and environmental implications, is there any work going on, or is there any other unit other than this, the UN OCHA structure?
There was also a question
from the Netherlands.
From the Netherlands on the presentation by Murali on the.
Mr. Boer, you can unmute yourself if you want now to raise your question, or we will read it.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Perfect.
So thank you, first of all, for this briefing jointly organized by UNEP and OCHA, which I think illustrates really our common increased understanding of the way in which environmental factors play into a humanitarian crisis and vice versa. It's also wonderful to have an insight into the inner workings of the UNEP OCHA Joint Environment Unit. So I'm happy to have listened into this briefing. Would just like to ask one question relating to the oil tanker, which is currently loaded with oil about 60 kilometers off the coast of Yemen, which you alluded to earlier, and thank you for that. There are risks of leaks, explosions, or a fire, and we have taken good note of system-wide UN efforts to gain access to the oil tanker for reparation purposes. We understand that visas for requisite UN staff have now been issued to conduct necessary repairs on board the oil tanker, which is, of course, a very welcome development. But given the political nature of the situation, let's look forward to receiving an update from OCHA or UNEP on how exactly they are engaging in contingency planning measures for potential leaks, fires, or explosions. You mentioned that you are engaging together with the IMO on working or on setting out a contingency plan, but I would like to ask you if there's any more specifics that you could give. And maybe UNEP or OCHA has any other conflict-sensitive recommendations to prevent an environmental disaster from taking place. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. So I think we got two questions that relate more to the prevention aspect and maritime safety. I don't know who wants to. Okay.
Thank you, Bruno, and thank the member states for those interesting questions. The first one about the long-term impact, yes, indeed, both these cases, both in Beirut as well as in Mauritius, are linked one way or other to maritime shipping, port operations, and so on. And in light of this, what happened, clearly there would be really looking at the standard operating procedures. The situation in Beirut, for example, is something which is possibly present in hundreds of other ports where chemicals which have been confiscated or stored for a long time, and then the attention on that topic then wanes a little bit, and then subsequently, and there is no specific honor to that, and so on and so forth. And I can imagine, and I already know that a number of countries are already ordering audit of their port facilities. So that's at the national level in terms of due diligence. But I can imagine this will become a subject of discussion, and more standard operating procedures would come on how to deal with this type of cargo, which has been in place for an extended period of time with no specific ownership or under court procedures and so on and so forth. So that has not happened yet, but that's something which is to be expected. Regarding the ship incident, as you know, this is an industry which is extremely well regulated, and any new incident would also be discussed in detail in IMO, in their procedures, and see whether was there anything which was amiss in the current existing standard operating procedures which created this incident, or should we have some different operating procedure in case something happens. So at this point of time, I think it's too early for that type of discussions to happen, but it's clearly something on our mind and also that of IMO, and clearly that of many member states. So a lessons learned incident on both of these can be expected in due course. Regarding the question on Yemen, yes, we have been engaged in this almost for a year now. On 19th and 20th of February, UNEP, IMO, the Special Envoy's Office, UK, the government of UK, US, the government of Yemen, the government of Saudi Arabia, OCHA, UNOPS, and the company which operates the ship, we all came together in Amman, and we discussed how to deal with an emergency should it happen. Of course, our preference number one is that the risk is reduced, and as you said, a team has been identified, their visas has been issued, and they are being mobilized. And hopefully, they will be able to prevent that disaster. But should that not happen, we started working in February together. I also want to mention this organization called PERSIGA, which is a regional organization where all the littoral countries of Red Sea are members. An initial regional contingency plan was already prepared by PERSIGA and commented by both IMO and UNEP. This look at the current contingency plans in place in various countries and some of the shortfalls and how to deal with them. Concurrently, we are working with IMO, and we have an expert currently based with IMO, who is working full-time on it, on preparing a SAFER-specific contingency plan, looking at what are the immediate responses needed in terms of alert, in terms of warning neighboring states, in terms of getting regional resources currently in place. For example, Saudi Aramco has a lot of resources. There are some joint resources of Persiga sitting in Egypt. There are other commercial actors such as Oil Spill Response Limited based in Singapore as well as the UK. So we are identifying all this. We are also looking at the challenges of deploying people in two separate complications. One, of course, is the complication of COVID. So something which was very easy in the past is not that easy anymore. As Charlotte mentioned, to deploy someone to Mauritius could take a week. So how do we get around that? But also, there is an issue of an ongoing conflict. So some of the countries which normally would have come immediately for response, some of the private agencies, such as Oil Spill Response, which would have come immediately with their own aircraft, may not come in this situation. So how do we ensure that we have some sort of a security guarantee for people to operate? So we are working on all these specific details as we speak. I'm in almost day-to-day touch with International Maritime Organization, and we are working collaboratively as IMO, OCHA, UNOPS, Special Envoy's Office, and we are in touch with all parties, including the government in Yemen, the Saudi government, Persiga, our own regional office in Bahrain, and so on. And as soon as we have this contingency plan in place, we will start to exercise on a desktop basis a few scenarios. But as you also know, it's not just about the plan, it's also about the planning. So we are also including as many stakeholders in the planning process, and very soon we will have our initial plan ready for exercising. Hopefully, we will never have to operationalize it. We are also looking for additional resources so that it's not just a plan, we can also strengthen the capacity in the region to deal with it. So we'll have to strengthen capacity in each of the countries around it. We'll have to provide things, including personal protective equipment, to the people who would be there in the ground dealing with oil, for which the facility don't exist. So we are also looking for those financial resources needed for that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And I think with this, and because it's 10:25, and we'd like to finish on time, I'm looking around if there are on the other hand raised, but they are not. So I'll give the floor to Gary for some conclusion remarks. And Gary.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the presenters and to the colleagues who are here in the room and those who are overseas and have also sent in questions. I have three things I'd like to say in conclusion. The first is to thank Diana and our respective teams for helping to put this on, and to you, Bruno, for chairing so well and so on time. The second is to reflect a little bit on what we heard this morning. I take pride as a guy who's been working in the UN for over 3 decades at the speed with which our teams were able to deploy and support the response in those 2 cases, and also in the case of what we're doing on COVID. I was also pleased to see the extent to which we supported UN coordination. Now, many of you will know that our Secretary General is emphasizing UN reform, and one central aspect of that is an empowered resident coordinator and humanitarian coordinator. And in both cases of Mauritius and Beirut, we were able to demonstrate how the work of our team supported that coordinated response. Still on the second point of what you heard this morning, you also will have heard, and Murli adverted to it just now, that we can't do this without funding. We cannot do this without resources. I mean, Charlotte was mentioning the fact that we kind of had to chip in with IMO to fund our expert to go down to Mauritius. Fortunately, we were able to do that, but it will be great to not have to worry about that type of cash balance situation. So some things to think about from this morning's response. My third point is to talk about the future, and it relates to the issue of human security or human insecurity. So the key point that I'd like to convey is expect more of these to happen. Expect more of these to happen. Our climate is warming, we have nature breakdown, and we will start to see, we're already seeing it, floods, storms, heat waves, droughts, sea level rise, and impacts of unimaginable ferocity in the future, affecting competition and scarcity for resources and pathways to human insecurity that relate to food, water, energy, movement, and supply chain. Given that that is part of the adaptation and resilience building efforts that we must have for the future, I believe it will be important for our work to be strengthened. What you saw this morning, as I mentioned at the very beginning, is only one part of the 4 areas of our team's work. We talked mainly about response, but we are also involved in recovery, stabilization, early warning, and prevention. So I'd like to end, if I may, Bruno, by suggesting that if there are countries listening in, that we consider something like what some of our member states have done in New York, in fact, creating a group of friends on the issue of environmental security. That is something that we'd be happy to support, but it would of course need to be generated from among our member states. Bruno, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Gary. And if I may just add on this call that you just made, that indeed any crisis, whether it's human-made, whether it's nature bringing it to us, whether it's induced by the 3 planetary crises that we're facing, biodiversity loss, climate change, pollution, any crisis has a deep negative impact on the SDG. And we know that we've got 10 years left to achieve these SDGs, and it's time really to act, to get all our strengths united. That's what we do in the UN, the coordination that we saw, that you explained, the UN acting as one in rapid response and in long-term planning. But we need, as you said, support of our stakeholders, of our member states, understanding from our citizens that we are delivering on our mandate, and that multilateralism is the answer to these many crises and many issues. With these words, I'd like to close this meeting. Please go on the GEN website. You can download all the presentations that were made. Colleagues who made presentations are available if there are further questions, of course, and we will meet again in this GEN format. I'm looking at Diana
at the end of the month for a conference organized within the framework of Alternativa on what does the International Geneva on climate change. That session will be in French, but we might be with you online before that.
For sure. So please follow the GEN on social media and on the website, because we want to keep the subject of environment very, very strongly on your agenda in the International Geneva and outside, as we are now also online. Thanks a lot, and I wish you a good day further.